Good? Yes? The title of my talk, Knowing Through Nursing, comes from Shakespeare's King Lear. A series of tragic events lead to the blinding of Lear's old friend Gloucester. His son, Edgar, disguised as a mad beggar, sees his father through his final sufferings and death. As the play comes to an end, Edgar is asked, "How have you known the miseries of your father?" And Edgar responds, "By nursing them, my lord." I love the idea that Edgar comes to know by nursing. This is a key question in the philosophy of nursing. What are the ways of knowing that belong to nursing as a discipline and practice? How do the nurse's ways of knowing belong to the embodied skill and craft of the practitioner? What about the caregiver's relational attunement to others? What about the affordances of the designed environment of healing? And the ethical, spiritual, cultural, and even aesthetic outlooks of the parties? What is the role of the family and the community in healing? How does inequity affect access to knowledge, training, and resources? And how does the nurse engage with those factors and herself suffer them? Miriam Bender, our host and my colleague, and Dina Elias argue that, quote, "the aesthetic pattern of knowing is critical for nursing practice." Bender contrasts aesthetic with an E and aesthetic with an AE, whereas the Greek term has come to be identified with artistic experience. She drops the A in order to encompass a broader range of experience, including clinical expertise, clinical judgment, tacit knowledge, and human caring. Well, Shakespeare is aesthetic in both senses, right? He clearly created art that helps audiences expand our imaginative and mental capacities. As an actor and theater maker, he was also practicing a craft composed of an ensemble of physical, mental, emotional, and interpersonal skills: dance and sword fighting, memorizing and declaiming, listening and responding. Both actors and nurses respond to situations with tact, empathy, embodied knowledge, and a worldview that is based on shared stories, maxims, and commitments. And when Shakespeare represents scenes of care, he sometimes manifests an understanding of these and other virtues shared by nurses and actors. He also depicts care in social settings that are shaped by gender, class, and cultural expectations, as well as by features of the built environment. Care is a performance, an action that takes place among persons and sometimes in front of persons, in real time and space, as a dialogue or conversation that unfolds in response to stories and story types of birthing, growing, healing, aging, and dying. As exercises in care, nursing and acting are examples of affective labor. That means forms of employment that use and sometimes use up the personal presence, attention, and life story of the worker in the service of others. Teaching is also affective labor. Nurses and actors are also organizational workers who pursue goals in concert with others in purposeful environments. Thinking about nursing from both the care perspective, which is deeply personal and affective, and the organizational perspective, which emphasizes distributed cognition and environmental affordances, has helped me see Shakespeare's performances of care in a new way. I'm going to share some of my thoughts with you today. most famous nurse in Shakespeare is known simply as the nurse. She is the comic, body-loving, and pragmatic nanny of Juliet Capulet. And of course, she's not a nurse in our modern sense at all. The word nurse is from the Anglo-French nourrice, meaning wet nurse. To nurse means to nourish. Although later applied to the duties of the sick nurse, the term itself implies the advancement of health, the cultivation of flourishing as its central end or aim. And although the nurse's aim in Romeo and Juliet sometimes misses its mark due to the distorted values of the aristocratic family and her own lapses in judgment, the nurse remains constant in her careful attention to her young charge. In the first scene with Juliet, the nurse recounts her relationship with the Capulet family.
Nurse! Where's my daughter? Call her forth to me.
Now, by my maidenhead at 12-year-old, I bade her come. What lamb? What ladybird? God forbid, where's this girl? What Juliet?
Hello, who calls?
Your mother.
Oh, madam, I am here. What is your will? This is the matter. Nurse, give leave a while. We must talk in secret. Nurse, come back again. I have remembered me. Thou's here our counsel. Thou knowst my daughter's of a pretty age.
Well, faith, I can tell her age into an hour.
She's not 14.
I lay 14 in my teeth, she's not 14. How long is it now till Lammastide?
Fortnights and odd days.
Or even odd. Of all the days of the year, come Lammas Eve at night, shall she be 14? Susan and she, God rest all Christian souls, were of an age. Well, Susan is with God. She was too good for me. Mary, I remember it well. 'Tis since the earthquake now, 11 years, and she was weaned. I never shall forget it. Of all the days of the year upon that day. For I had then laid wormwood to me dug, sitting in the sun under the dove house wall. My lord knew her then at Mantua. Nay, I do bear a brain. And since that time, it is 11 years. For then she could stand alone. Even the day before, she broke her brow. And then my husband, God be with his soul, oh, was a merry man, took up the child. Yea, quoth he, just to fall upon thy face, thou wilt fall backwards when thou hast more wit, wilt thou not, Julie? And by my holly dam, the pretty wretch left crying and said, aye! To see now our jest may come about. I warrant and I should live 1,000 years, I never should forget it. Wilt thou not, Jolie? Okay. Pretty fool, it stinted and said, aye!
Enough of this, I pray thee, hold thy peace.
And I warrant, it had upon it brow a bump as big as a young cockerel stone. Yea, quoth me husband, false upon thy face, thou wilt fall backwards when thou comest of age. Wilt thou not, Jolie? It's
I pray thee, nurse, say aye.
Peace, I've done. Oh, God mark thee to his grace. Thou wast the prettiest babe that e'er I nursed, and I might live to see thee married once. I have no wish.
Marry! That marry is the very theme I came to talk of.
Often played for laughs, there's actually a lot going on there. We learn that the nurse's own daughter, Susan, the same age as Juliet, had died, freeing the nurse's breasts and her affective labor for the care of Juliet. So the work of mourning is built into the office of care. We also learned that she used a home remedy, wormwood, to wean Juliet. And there's a lot of bawdy jesting. Like a midwife, the nurse knows all about sex, and she's going to put that knowledge to use later in the play. All of this unfolds within the memory of an environment of care. The nurse weaned baby Juliet sitting in the sun under the Dove House wall. The spatial notation mixes warmth and shade, open air and partial seclusion, the crafted solidity of architecture with the ambient presence of birds. The nurse has chosen a location for weaning that supports their own bodies as a caring dyad, while other forms of life stir and beckon around them. The rhythmic composite of wall, ground, sky, breath, breast, and birds contribute to what Bender and Holmes call the world as process, in which reality is a continuous construction, and subject and object are products, not independent constituents of that reality. I think you get a sense of that process as reality in this Impressionist painting by Mary Cassatt, in which human subjects, human objects, physical objects, and the process of washing merge with the act of painting itself. The scene is a recollection, but it's also an action, a dance of solicitudes involving three parties, not two. Juliet sometimes jumps on the nurse's lap to relive this tale of her toddlerhood. Meanwhile, Lady Capulet strives for intimacy when she sends the nurse away, but then she loses confidence and decides to recall the nurse. The affective labor of the nurse compensates for the emotional distance of the mother, and the nurse becomes a mediator between the mother and the daughter, able to facilitate a tough conversation about marriage that Lady Capulet is unable to initiate on her own. The nurse's speech evokes a whole world defined by patterns of privilege and labor, work and rest, and human and animal cohabitation. It's really not a description so much as an abstraction, in the sense that is defined by Professor Bender. The nurse assembles the conditions that matter for what we have a care for and want to produce as a potential future reality. It is a selective description oriented towards the shared environment of care that she and Juliet build together. An environment is literally that which environs or surrounds, as the courtyard enveloped nurse and child that summer afternoon. An environment is also that which flows and interconnects. It's a web of exchanges that's vulnerable to disturbance. And nurses are managers of environments. They are organizational workers in a stratified and intricate domestic economy. We can understand the nurse's organizational duties by turning to two kinds of texts from the period: midwifery manuals and housekeeping guides. I'm especially interested in books by women, though they are written decades after Shakespeare's death, including this guide for midwives by Jane Sharp and the domestic guides of Hannah Woolley, sometimes called the Martha Stewart of the 17th century. Jane Sharp describes the ideal nurse in terms that sound a lot like Shakespeare's nurse. And you can see this discourse embodied in this wonderful portrait of a nurse and child by Franz Hals. Sharp writes, "A nurse ought to be of a good complexion and constitution. A good, wholesome nurse may correct the natural humors of the child if the mother has an ill complexion herself. The nurse should be of a ruddy, merry, cheerful, delightsome countenance, and clear-skinned, so that her veins appear through it. Such a woman is sociable, not subject to melancholy. She is jovial and will sing and dance, taking great delight in children." This portrait of a type is also a study in processes. Complexion, constitution, and humor are all process words. They refer to the humoral medicine that still reigned in the period, which conceived of the human mind and body as part of a shifting climate of humors. And the nurse was herself a manager of processes, caring for the climate changes of her charge, caring for Julia's own complexion and constitution. The nurse was a manager of processes in another sense, because she participated in the personnel, workflow, and technologies of a largely self-sustaining Renaissance household. Hannah Woolley wrote a guide for women domestic workers that included the nursery maid in its inventory of employment possibilities, with the waiting woman or lady in waiting at the very top to the scullery maid at the bottom. The nursemaid was towards the middle of this hierarchy. Shakespeare's nurse seems rather to combine nursery maid and housekeeper. Housekeepers and nurses were expected to master basic medicine. Woolley's book provides the choicest receipts or recipes and rarest secrets in physic and chirurgery. Chirurgery is an early spelling of surgery, and it covered that part of medical science and art which required manual operation. Physic, on the other hand, refers to the use of herbal remedies, whether as cordials, pills, ointments, suppositories, enemas, or aromatherapy. Midwives were practicing physic when they applied baths, ointments, and various fumigations to their patients. They were practicing surgery when they used their hands to deliver babies. The midwife might also use tools, especially for a C-section, which was normally conducted when the mother had already died. She would also have access to a chair or even possibly a birthing stool. Interestingly, both physic and surgery figure in the nurse's recollection of care. The wormwood applied to her nipples is a bitter ointment, and the toddler who fell and hurt her head may have required a plaster of some kind. Such skills are part of the nurse's job description, part of her basic competencies. Woolley's Guide to Domestic Service sketches the rudiments of what nursing scholar Davina Allen calls a strategic action field. That's a social order in which actors work together in a shared field of goals, routines, and technologies. Birthing manuals refer to the midwife herself, but also to nursemaids and other female attendants in a space that is filled with linens, remedies, chairs, heating devices, and bathing equipment, as seen in this picture of the birth of Mary. Notice on the shelf that there are vessels that might hold ointments and cordials. A Hebrew inscription that begins Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh graces the wall. And in the middle ground, a woman is tending a fire, making sure that the temperature of the room is appropriate. This unusually direct image from 1800 depicts a birthing chair. Notice the other remedies on hand. A midwife and a nurse are present, but there's also a man midwife. Those are the surgeons who had begun to displace women midwives by the end of the 18th century. The wealthy urban household in Romeo and Juliet includes the nurse, serving men, retainers, pages, and musicians. Tools and technologies at hand include clocks and torches, pots and pans, masks and marzipan, gloves and dishcloths, swords and sonnets, and a very handy rope ladder. The household's busy organizational space reflects the theater's own organizational structures, an ensemble of thespians, bookkeepers, and stagehands in command of an inventory of objects. This title page from 1623 captures the manifold skills and environments that the nurse manages over the course of Shakespeare's play. You see physic and surgeries listed first, and after that, the ordering of great feasts. Think of the Capulet ball where Romeo and Juliet meet, but also the wedding party that Lord Capulet directs the nurse to organize for Juliet in Paris later in the play. The housekeeper must also be able to make distillations and perfumes, which would be medicinal as well as cosmetic. This is a beautiful Italian apothecary jar from the period. Imagine picking that up from CVS. At one point in the play, the nurse calls for aqua vita. That's a form of ethanol distilled from wine and often further enriched with spices. This cure-all is good for swelling of the lungs, heartburn, and melancholy and phlegm. Aqua mirabilis indeed. Creating such concoctions took skill and specialized equipment. You can see a housekeeper making medicinal cordials with a limbeck here. So the housekeeper is a kitchen physician in a complex organizational space, as she is named in this title page from 1689. As the household rushes to arrange Juliet's marriage to the father's chosen suitor, a guy named Paris, Lord Capulet calls the nurse to, quote, fetch more spices. And he also calls her by her name, Angelica. Angelica is a plant used medicinally as well as for flavoring. The nurse's close association with the friar, who actually grows plants for their medical virtues, further links the nurse to household medical know-how. And indeed, Romeo and Juliet features a description of an actual Renaissance apothecary shop where Romeo picks up some poison while weekending in Mantua that might have looked like this, or even like this, because Romeo actually mentions alligators. This room is like a library or database of remedies, another example of organizational space. Although nurses were associated primarily with birth and early childhood, nurses could also be sick nurses, drafted from within the household to care for the diseased, the dying, and the dead. Here is a maidservant keeping watch over a bedridden person. And here is another maidservant feeding someone who is ill. In the Comedy of Errors, Adriana, concerned that her husband has gone mad, says that she will attend to my husband, be his nurse, diet his sickness, for it is my office. An office is an ensemble of duties. An office implies organizational as well as emotional intelligence. In Romeo and Juliet, the nurse is birth, bride, and death attendant. She is a curator of transitions, a term that nursing scholars use to describe the crises and eventualities, as well as the micro changes that nurses oversee and adjudicate. Understanding transitions, writes nursing scholar Patricia Benner, necessarily engages historical reasoning. Juliet's nurse enlists historical reasoning when she contributes her attention, care, and concern, as well as her memory and her storytelling capacities to her charges, needs, and desires, along with a generous serving of aqua vita, the water of life, the flow of process, distilled or abstracted into a sweet cordial of skillful care and organizational smarts. So, the nurse participates in the culture of know-how that is amply demonstrated in the period's midwifery and housekeeping manuals. But Miriam Bender and her nursing philosopher co-authors aim higher than epistemology or the science of knowing. They are after ontology, or the philosophy of being. What is the nature of the reality addressed in nursing? Is there a metaphysics or meta paradigm that establishes what counts as real for nurses and nursing science? Bender finds an answer in process philosophy, which really has its roots in the ancient philosopher Heraclitus, who declared famously that reality is a river. But process philosophy receives its modern articulation in the writings of Alfred Whitehead. Process is what is, and nursing is ultimately an art of responding to processes, from the great transitions of life and death to the tiny changes that signal the shift in an illness, the lurch towards birth, or the onset of morbidity. The basic points, as I understand them, are these. First, reality is composed of processes, which include natural, psychic, and social phenomena. Second, different disciplines and practices organize reality, the reality of process, based on their own working concepts and organizing goals. 3, the practices of a discipline continually perform and indeed bring into being these key concepts and the reality that they compose. In nursing, these concepts include nursing itself, person, environment, and health, all of which we've touched on today. And one consequence of this is that nursing and nursing science are inherently dynamic and never deterministic. Although we have already touched on elements of this meta paradigm in the nurses' performances of care, I think we really need to go to Shakespeare's later, deeper works to find some parallels. So I would like to spend my remaining time with Edgar and King Lear. Remember that Edgar is the young man who gave me the title of this talk. And then Shakespeare's Cleopatra. And I'm also going to spend some time with an intriguing passage from my favorite midwife, Mrs. Jane Sharp. We already saw that Edgar identifies himself with nursing when he says that he came to know his father's sufferings by nursing them. He describes himself as pregnant to good pity, and he acts as a kind of midwife or doula to his father's death. So how does he exactly do that? What is the course of treatment here? When Edgar meets his recently blinded father, Gloucester is in despair, not only over his loss of vision, but over his realization that he had falsely accused his son, that same Edgar, of conspiring against him. And now he wants to die. And he asks the disguised Edgar to lead him to the edge of Dover Cliff, where he plans to leap to his death. That's a big ask. And Edgar doesn't quite know what to do. He could tell his father then and there who he is, but he's worried that this knowledge will simply kill his father. And he also seems to intuit that this journey to Dover could have its own therapeutic effects. It's a pilgrimage and a meditative exercise that might promise some rehab and repair. As they near Dover, Edgar guides his father through an imaginary fall from the heights of the cliff to the shore beneath, using visual description to create the mental picture of the scene from above. It's a description, but it's also an abstraction in the sense developed by Bender and Holmes, since the word picture leads Gloucester into the vanishing point that is the destination of the exercise. Edgar, in fact, must design and assess multiple plans on the fly: assisted suicide or outright refusal of his father's wishes. Can he devise a course of care that might both respect and prevent his father's death wish, while also preparing him for recognition and a softer way of dying? Let's look at the scene.
When shall I come to the top of that same hill?
You do climb up it now. Look how we labor.
He thinks the ground is even.
Horrible steep. Hark, do you hear the sea?
No, truly.
Why then? Your other senses growing perfect by your eyes' anguish.
So may it be indeed.
Yeah. Come on, sir. Here's the place. Stand still. How fearful and dizzy 'tis to cast one's eyes so low. The crows and choughs that wing the midway air show scarce so gross as beetles. Halfway down hangs one that gathers samphire. Dreadful trade. Methinks he seems no bigger than his head. The fishermen that walk upon the beach appear like mice. And yon tall anchoring bark, diminished to her cock a boy almost too small for sight. The murmuring surge that on the unnumbered idle pebbles chafes cannot be heard so high.
Set me where you stand.
Give me your hand. You're now within a foot of the extreme verge.
Here, my friend, is a jewel, well worth a poor man's taking. Go thou farther off. Bid me farewell, and let me hear thee going.
Now fare ye well, good sir.
With all my heart.
Why I do trifle thus with his despair is done to cure it.
O you mighty gods, this world I do renounce, and in your sight shake patiently my great affliction off, if I could bear it longer, and not fall to quarrel with thy great opposeless wills. My snuff-loathing part of nature should burn itself out. If Edgar live, oh bless him. Now, fellow, fare thee well.
Gone, sir, farewell. Oh, you, sir? Friend, hear you, sir? Speak! Yet he revives. What are you, sir?
Away and let me die.
Hadst thou been aught but gossamer, feathers, air, so many fathoms down precipitating, thou shivered like an egg. 10 masts each make not the altitude which thou hast perpendicularly fell. Thy life's a miracle. Speak yet again.
Yet have I fallen or no?
From the dread summit of this chalky bourne. Oh. Do but look up.
Alack, I have no eyes. Is wretchedness deprived that benefit to end itself by death?
Up! So, how is they feeling your legs? You stand.
Too well, too well.
This is above all strangeness. Upon the crown of the cliff, what thing was that which parted from you?
A poor unfortunate beggar.
As I stood here below, methought his eyes were 2 full moons. He had 1,000 noses, horns whelked and waved like the enrigid sea. It was some fiend, Therefore, thou happy father, think that the clearest gods who make them honours of men's impossibilities have here preserved thee.
I do remember now. Henceforth, I'll bear affliction till it do cry out itself, enough, enough, and die.
Many readers have criticized Edgar for deceiving his father, but I see the two of them as co-composing this experience together. It's Gloucester, the father, who initiates the journey and who begins to sketch its final image in their mind's eyes, while Edgar guides them forward and completes the picture. Nursing philosopher Jean Watson seeks wisdom from what she calls, quote, ancient and even modern practices of suggestion, visualization, imagery, and belief, close quote. Techniques that also describe Edgar's unusual, but not wholly unprecedented approach to palliative care. So where is the process philosophy in this scene? Here I want to return to midwife Jane Sharp, who comments at several points in her treatise on the role of the imagination in well-being. In the anatomy section of her book, the imagination contributes to both male and female sexual functioning. She has a wonderful section on the clitoris. Later, in a brief discourse on the healthful effects of fresh air, she groups together a range of psychic functions in a picture of well-being that literally belongs to the atmosphere we breathe. Fresh air makes the reason and understanding ready. Good vital and animal spirits are bred by it, whereby all things to reason become more subservient. Opinion, fancy, judgment, resolution, apprehension, imagination, memory, knowledge, mirth, hope, trust, joy, and urbanity are produced by it. Meats and drinks feed the body, but the air guides the mind in almost all of its actions. And life and health, sickness and death depend most upon it. Sharp is considering fresh air pragmatically from the perspective of health and well-being, but I think something more is going on here. By associating air with the atmosphere we breathe, with the thoughts we think, with the emotions we feel, with the sociable virtues we practice, and with our animal spirits or vitality, she is really addressing air as one of the four elements of ancient cosmologies, along with fire, earth, and water. The ancient Stoics saw pneuma, air, spirit, breath of life, as actually a combination of fire and air. And it's this pneuma that constitutes the human soul or psyche, but also existed in inanimate objects as the tensile force that organizes matter. Edgar leads his father through a fabrication built from pneuma, the airy nothing of its speech, the breath of their shared presence, and the creaturely vitality that surrounds them. In concert with his father, he performs Sharp's comportments of imagination, memory, hope, and trust in relation to the horizons of life and death that he, as nurse and midwife, shepherds with such care. Notice how in the clip we just watched, Edgar closes his eyes to create the mental experience that the two of them are sharing. In conjuring the imagined reality of Dover Cliff through spoken words and shared gestures, Nurse Edgar is composing a reality of processes whose flows include animal and vegetable life, the efforts of work and labor, the murmuring surge of the sea, and the hermeneutic burdens and pressures of a distinctively human life and death. The process power of fire and air return at the end of Antony and Cleopatra. It may seem odd to think of Cleopatra as a nurse, but the historical Cleopatra was associated with a range of medical writings, including tracts on gynecology, cosmetics, and alchemy. Both Plutarch and Shakespeare report that Cleopatra conducted empirical research on the easiest ways to die. She wanted to find a poison that would leave her body beautiful and intact rather than swollen or covered with a vile and loathsome crust like King Hamlet. Here's an apothecary jar with Cleopatra painted on its surface. Do the contents promise beauty, an easy death, or both? Surrounded by her women and sequestered in her monument at the end of the play, Cleopatra carefully plans and performs her own death. When she puts the snake to her breast, she describes herself as nursing it. Dost thou not see my baby at my breast that sucks the nurse asleep? Here you see her surrounded by her attendants in a kind of birth chair that is also a death chair. Edgar was midwife to his father's death. Cleopatra is midwife to her own death. I talked about abstraction earlier as a way of understanding the kind of careful memory notation that the nurse performs with Juliet and Lady Capulet, and that Edgar practices with his father. Cleopatra understands her own death as a kind of abstraction, as she wills herself to become one with the cosmos. I am fire and air. My other elements I give to baser life. Fire and air. Well, that recalls the pneuma of the Stoics and the primal fire of Heraclitus, whom Bender and Holmes describe as the first process philosopher. In willing herself to become fire and air, she is abstracting herself. Bender and Holmes write that abstractions extend the world rather than correspond to it, and they argue that the world that is so extended is continually brought into being by the nurse's performance of care. In Cleopatra's death scene, she speaks and acts like a philosopher as well as a nurse, conjuring a reality composed of processes to which she commits her living, dying being. Ontology involves metaphysics, not a word that is handled kindly in most scholarly discourses today. Yet Professor Bender is courageously engaging metaphysics by putting questions of being at the center of nursing. In that spirit, I want to tell a little story about metaphysics and care. In the spring of 2020, as part of my recovery from a traffic accident, I spent many hours a week with a gifted physical therapist named Dawn. Towards the end of our time together, we came to speak about matters of meaning. Curious about the cross that she wore around her neck, I asked her if she had always been a religious person. She replied slowly, even cautiously, "No, not really. It was during the first years of my work as a physical therapist. I realized that when I was helping people in their healing process, God was working through me." Was Dawn being fanciful or self-aggrandizing or mystical? Or was she actually articulating a truth about how the forms of vitality and capacity practiced and fostered in care extend beyond the two partners in healing to touch not only families and workplaces, but the operation, the processes of the world itself? Now, Dawn clearly had a personal God in mind, but I think one can also think like Heraclitus and the Stoics, who understood fire and air as processes shared across the cosmos, processes in which health and well-being participate. So to know by nursing is to intuit in and through the intimate tactility, of tending to the birth, growth, healing, or dying of another person, a sense of purpose and meaning, of telos or goal. The four elements, the four humors, the river of being, the fresh air of Jane Sharp, the resonant imaginings of Edgar and Gloucester, and the fire and air of Cleopatra are all efforts or abstractions that seek to understand life and death and the reality renewing care for life and death as processes that concern being in an existential and metaphysical sense. And I find that very exciting. Let's give Cleopatra, queen, scientist, philosopher, midwife, and nurse, the last words.
Give me my robe. Put on my crown. I have immortal longings in me. Now no more the juice of Egypt's grape shall moist this lip. Yar, yar, good Iris, quick. Methinks I hear Antony call. I see him rouse himself to praise my noble act. I hear him mock the luck of Caesar, which the gods give men to excuse their after wrath. Husband, I come. Now to that name my courage prove my title. I am fire and air. My other elements I give to baser life. So, have you done? Come then, and take the last warmth of my lip. Farewell, kind Charmian. Iris, long farewell. Have I the aspic in my lips? Dost fall? If thou and nature can so gently part, the stroke of death is as a lover's pinch, which hurts and is desired. Dost thou lie still? If thus thou vanishest, thou tells the world it is not worth leave taking. This proves me base. If first she meet the curled Antony, he'll make demand of her and spend that kiss which is my heaven to have. Come, thou mortal wretch, with thy sharp teeth, this knot intrinsicate of life at once untie. Poor venomous fool, be angry and dispatch. Oh, couldst thou speak that I might hear thee call great Caesar ass unpolicied. Oh, peace, peace. Dost thou not see my baby at my breast? That sucks the nurse asleep. Oh, sweet as balm, as soft as air, as gentle. Oh, Antony. Nay, I will take thee too. What? Should I stay?
Julia, if you would like to.
Yeah, I think you need to open my video for me. It says you cannot start your video. There we go. Okay.
I wanted to thank you. Thank you so much for that. I'm speechless once again. Thank you so much. I have learned so much, and wow, yeah, I liked your readings of my work. That was
Well,
very.
I enjoy getting to read your articles and think about them, and affirming my sense that we have many commitments in common, intellectually and otherwise.
So we already have a series of questions. I would like to once again, please, if you have a question or a comment that you'd like to articulate, please put it in the Q&A box. I'm going to start with a very descriptive question. Did Shakespeare have a wet nurse? Was that the custom in his Towner family?
You mean, so did he? Well, we don't have a lot of biographical information about Shakespeare. It's possible that his mother had a wet nurse, if that's what Kirk is asking. I think it was Kirk Davis who was asking that. There's also the question of, did his wife have a wet nurse, use a wet nurse with their children? He, of course, his wife did have twins, and twins were, possibly difficult to suckle on your own. By the time that Shakespeare is a father, he's doing fairly well financially, so it's certainly possible that they would have had a wet nurse. But Shakespeare, as both father and son, was a member of the gentry, the middle class, really the lower gentry, not even really the gentry, the trades class. So it's possible, but we don't know.
Okay, wonderful. And Kirk also just wanted to make a statement about male nurses. He was cared by male nurses at Hogue for a minor procedure. And he talked about them being great at using soothing and comforting words more than anything else. And he alluded to doctors' talk seeming more scientific and cold, perhaps of necessity. So the soothing and comforting words, to mirror what you were talking about, abstractions creating understandings and atmospheres of care. Does that seem
yeah, no,
those
are great comments. I certainly think that the nursing as a vocation, a metaphor, a comportment, we do see applied to male as well as female characters in Shakespeare. So we see it very much with Edgar, who is referred to as himself being pregnant with pity, and who has this midwife-like, I would argue, midwife-like relationship to his father, Gloucester, that's parallel to Cordelia's more classically nursey relationship to her father, King Lear. And we see similar imagery, for example, in As You Like It, where the young man, Orlando, takes charge of, he has an aging servant, not surgeon. He has an aging servant named Adam, who's supposed to be, taking care of Orlando as they disappear into exile in the forest. But then the old guy gets really ill, and their offices reverse. And now the young nobleman, Orlando, has to become a nurse to the aged servant, Adam. And it's a very beautiful moment where I think Shakespeare is thinking about class and our mutual obligations to each other beyond the status system that was very, very rigid in Shakespeare's day. And the young Orlando compares himself to a doe taking care of her fawn. And so he uses this imagery of nursing from the animal kingdom to talk about how he is now nursing the old man Adam. So that's another example of a male nurse in Shakespeare. So these comportments are traveling, even if the idea of the wet nurse kind of attaches nursing to the female in a certain way.
Thank you for that. Here is a question from Duncan. Hello, Duncan. Nice to.
Hi, Duncan. You introduced Miriam and me. Thank you, Duncan.
So Duncan says, great talk, Julia. I'd like to ask a question about how this relates to Cavell's reading of Shakespeare. Is there something about the nursing context that ensures that knowledge is not problematized? For example, that it is in its nature that there is not the estrangement from the ordinary, a lack of attunement that Cavell thinks generates the skeptical problematic. Think Othello and Desdemona.
Yeah, thank you, Duncan. That's a great question. Yeah, I think that's kind of what I'm getting from you, Miriam, in terms of what, how is nursing different from doctoring or from other sciences of health? And it seems to me that if I'm understanding your arguments about that correctly, it has to do with this underdetermined, process-oriented connection to what is happening, in the now, which is a hermeneutic now. It's going back and forward with this kind of notion of the transition as fundamental to nursing science. And so that the nurse is, at their best, the nurse is engaging with their tacit, embodied understanding of the situation and not overthinking it. And that when things get too theoretical, too disembodied from the situation, then perhaps you get into the problem of knowledge being problematized in the way that Duncan points to in these comments. And so if you take a play like Othello gets too theoretical. Iago takes him on a journey of overthinking. And that overthinking brings him to question the fidelity of Desdemona and lead him into murderous activity. And Desdemona and Emilia are really the kind of nursing figures in the play. Emilia is very much, figured as a kind of a nursemaid and attendant, caregiver to Desdemona. But the two of them are a kind of different kind of relationship to knowledge than we see in Othello. So I don't know, Miriam, if you would want to comment on that, the role of, because I don't want to, over immerse the nurse in experience, right? She's got to also be theoretically, analytically, so do you want to comment on that?
Yes, it's interesting. I've been doing a lot of this reading lately, along with Mulhall and even Pearson as aesthetic. The idea that to not deflect from what is right in front of you. And I think that's like, I always say nursing steps in when medicine ends, when we don't know what to do anymore, that's when nursing steps in. You go to a hospital to receive nursing care because you're unstable. And so this idea of nursing as not deflecting, not putting images in front of attuning to what's there or what could be there, or the potentiality of a new expression of something different. I say something different because we always want our patients to be in a different place. For example, at the end of a shift, we want them to be in less pain than they were. We want them to be walking where they weren't walking. So the idea is not so much to know what's happening and then act on it, but to actually see a reality unfolding and how it can unfold in certain ways rather than others.
And that's how I understand your use of the word abstraction, which is not like an abstraction from reality. It's an abstraction in reality that helps orient you towards that goal that you are aiming for.
I would not use my own, the abstraction that I'm trying to understand is more Whitehead's and Deleuze's understanding of abstraction as the real. And how does one work that? Objectifying versus seeing what can be there that isn't pre-conceptualized. Yeah, I'm still trying to work my language around that. So So
No, I loved it.
thank you for challenging me.
It's very
Thank you,
exciting.
Duncan, for asking the question. I think it's a fantastic one. We have another question. Let me press done here. So Daphne says, wonderful presentation. I've learned so much. I was reminded of Suzuki Tadashi's production of King Lear, in which the fool is the male nurse, and the whole play takes place in a mental hospital, and Lear is on a wheelchair. Thoughts about a different kind of nurse for Lear?
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. Really, like the nurse, Edgar, Cordelia, and the fool are all kind of parallel figures in the play. They're all figures of attendance, of care, of concern. And they're also figures of people who are willing to use language in a way that is counter-normative to what is expected of them. Edgar, of course, disguises himself as a madman, which is a kind of a fool, and speaks this kind of fool language that is different from the semantics and syntax of the fool, the professional fool. But it's clearly, Shakespeare is experimenting with these different types of argot, these different vocabularies and speech patterns for madness. So I love that idea of the fool as a kind of a nurse. And I think he does have that function in the play. The attendant who is faithful in a different kind of way to Lear and administers a different kind of medicine than others do in the play. So thank you, Daphne. That's a wonderful comment.
And as you were speaking, I was looking at my notes, and you speak to nursing as description, and then to devise a course of care. And there's many different ways to do that as well. So I don't know exactly how they're linked. I am not familiar with King Lear at all, but this idea of devising courses of care and what that means, and there are no prescriptive ways, that's for sure.
Well, I think that's what we see in this amazing scene, where Edgar, his father is blinded, recently blinded, still bleeding in his bandages, and his son, who's disguised as this mad beggar, sees him. And there's the question, he asks him, please take me to Dover so I can kill myself there. And Edgar has to figure out what to do. And they have a long walk. Gloucester asks Edgar, do you know the way to Dover? And Edgar responds, oh, there are so many ways to Dover. There are footpaths and horse paths, and you sort of like, that's kind of an image there of like, well, there's lots of ways. You're going to die, old man, but there's a lot of ways in which we could get you there. And some might be better than others. And maybe having you jump from a cliff and shatter all your bones is not the best way for you to die, even though it's what you want. Maybe we do something that's a little bit more gentle, and that involves you and I getting to know each other again, and you still having some version of the experience that you've just asked for, which is clearly purgatorial and has to do with your own sense of guilt about what you did to me earlier in the play. And part of you needs this violence, but part of you maybe should be spared that violence because you've already been blinded by guests in your own house. Haven't you suffered enough? And so this kind of devising, like, okay, we got to get to Dover. What are we going to do when we get there? How do we get there? What do we talk about while we're there? How do I help him learn to walk as a blind man? How do I become his assistant in a progress towards healing that is palliative? We're on hospice here, but we're not going to make it lacking in dignity. We're not going to make it meaningless. We're going to make it as good as we can. And I don't know if it's the right thing. Because as underdetermined, but this is what I'm going to try. And I have a little bit of time to practice in my head because we have a long walk ahead of us. And it's going to be kind of slow because dad's not doing so well. So that's kind of what I mean by devise, which is a great medieval Renaissance word that is design, create, fabricate, imagine, figure out. It has a lot of different senses to it.
And that's, to me, I see as completely wholly applicable to nursing as well. That we are devising courses of care. We're co-creating our understanding. And what you were just saying was so not the term that you started out that discussion with, the devise course of care, is deception.
Right. And that's what, because Edgar does not reveal his identity to his father. And he pretends to have his father jump off this cliff. And so there's two schools of thought about this. And one is that it's brilliant and noble and a really cool solution to a difficult problem. And another is that Edgar is a liar and a cheat and has abused his father's trust and is actually kind of mean. I'm obviously in that first camp. But yeah, these are two ways of thinking about it. I think even Cavell, who Professor Pritchard mentioned easier, is more in the Edgar not such a nice guy camp. And I can't go there. I see Edgar as, it's trying something out, and, we're on the downward swoop of a terrible tragedy, but it's a pretty good solution within that swoop. I mean, if people are watching Station 11, which is very much about Shakespeare and plague and Shakespeare, can Shakespeare have a curative effect, and can it rehabilitate people who have gone to the dark side? Interesting questions there that are very related to this.
Fascinating. Let me put this question is done. There's some ideas in the chat box, but there is another question, which is a very general one, and it's how did nursing become a focus of interest for you?
Well, I think it definitely began when you and I were at that Duncan's conference on virtue and philosophy and education, and we got to talk about Shakespeare. I think that was, Duncan might be able to clarify this, but I think it was the fall of 2019. So it was before
pre-COVID.
It was definitely pre-COVID, because we were in a room together and we chatted and we had some nice emails. Yes. I believe it was fall of 2019, but it might have been fall of 2018. And then, of course, in 2020, we all started thinking about, we all meaning us non-nurses, started thinking about nurses and healthcare workers and frontline workers and exposure. And I think, nursing became a dominant topic, ethical, economic, all of that. And then at the same time, I was kind of laid up by a serious accident, and it was really the physical therapists and the nurses who did the most for me. I didn't really see many doctors. And that really struck me. Like, the healing that I need to go through is, first of all, it's a partnership. If I don't do my share, nothing's going to happen. They can't heal for me. And they're the ones who are here. They're the ones who are really engaged and making decisions and consulting with each other and with me, occupational, PT, speech, a range of different kinds of healers. And so I think that's when I wrote to you for some bibliography about nursing, because I was starting to think about King Lear in that context. And in fact, the first piece that I wrote during the spring of 2020 was on Edgar and nursing and care. And some of that is in the piece that I shared with you today, along with the new material on Juliet and the nurse, and also on Cleopatra, kind of, creating some more paradigms here and doing a bit more reading in the midwifing literature, because there's not a lot about nursing in the 16th and 17th century, because it was basically a household task. But midwives, there was more discourse on. And so I kind of found that there was a little bit more for me to kind of do classical research on. by bringing in the midwife as a kind of supplement to the nurse.
And your descriptions of the midwife were fantastic. And Jess Dillard Wright, a fellow here in the Center for Nursing Philosophy, wrote, "Thank you so much, Dr. Lupton. Your presentation was provocative and highlighted connections between Shakespeare and nursing in an exciting way." She's also interested in history and nursing and how words and ideas and current, like you mentioned, we're in an atmosphere, we're in a social order, we in a complex organizational space, and how does that influence, what gets thought of or documented as quote unquote nursing or midwifery. I don't know if, and Jess says I'm a midwife too, so I don't know if maybe she has a question she might want to ask you, but I really thought it was interesting how you brought out in these midwifery documents both the elements of nursing that are still in play today, very modern, but also how you brought out when you were talking about the fresh air being an atmosphere and performing, creating reality. To me, this was fascinating because with Nightingale, the modern founder of nursing as the dominant discourse is, the way that I teach her is she claimed the environment as nursing's own. And I think that you did. So I was thinking about that, the environment is the purview of nursing. We create environments of care. We work to, improve the environments or create environments or, maneuver environments. So I thought the parallel that ran through all your talk and demonstrations of midwifery was definitely akin. I don't know if there are any other nurses in the audience that want to speak to that as well.
Well, I remember going to a great talk by Ellen Olshansky a few years ago from your department, talking precisely about environments of healing and the need for a different design sensibility. And my sister, Ellen Lupton, is here today in the audience, and she's a designer and has a great show right now at the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York on epidemiology and design. And some of the innovations, environmental and technological design elements that have come out of historic, but also our current pandemic. So that design element is very important to me. And as part of my last book was called Shakespeare Dwelling, and it's very much about these environments of organizational task spaces, spaces of housekeeping, some spaces of care. That was somewhat less pronounced as a topic for me when I was writing that book, but sort of how this is evolving. And the Davina Allen essay that I cited, she talks about Nightingale in terms of an organizational thinker who is thinking about the designed environment and its role. So yeah, I think that's all really important. And of course, UCI is building a new health center over on North Campus. And, we hope that they'll really think it's a great opportunity to really think about the built environment and, what a mid 21st century hospital should look like, how it can, there'll be a museum attached to it. The new museum has also been recently endowed and will be on that same campus. So the idea that we'll have a museum and a hospital sharing parking and infrastructure, but also we hope human beings, patients, staff, visitors. I think that's very exciting, and that Irvine can kind of shape a new environment.
That's so interesting that you mentioned that museums and hospitals, and you talk about environments and spaces, and my way of orienting to structures and systems as bundles of processes. So you can think about patients. We need to ambulate our patients. Let's go and ambulate them over to the museum and have some lived experiences in that way. So
it's fantastic. And the collection is both modern art and California Impressionism. So there's going to be, different types of experiences we can offer our patients depending on what they're up for. I think it's fantastic.
No, wow, there's a whole line of thought there, but we do have another question from Mary Ellen, and they ask, do you see differences in care nursing in Shakespeare's characters depending on their class status or gender or ethnicity, for example, in Othello?
Right, that's a great question. Well, I think in the case of the nurse in Romeo and Juliet, I think you could see this in the RSC clip that I shared. The class is very pronounced, that the nurse is clearly from the working class, although she does have a lot of responsibilities in the household. And so I think she's kind of a nurse / housekeeper is how I think of her. But the class dimension is very pronounced there. In Othello, our nurse is Amelia, and she is a racist, and she's white, and she is very caring of Desdemona, but she also she overtrusts her husband Iago, so she's actually somewhat responsible for Desdemona's death. She's a complicated nurse figure, compromised, as well as, and the nurse in Romeo and Juliet is also compromised. She's not necessarily making all the right decisions with how she advises these young people. But there is a reference in Othello and Desdemona's Willow song to a maid called Barbary. And she says that's the person who sang this song to her. And various scholars, it could be just the name Barbara, but it could be a reference to the Barbary Coast, which is in the North African coast. And so many recent scholars have seen this as possible, that Desdemona had an African nursemaid who sang her songs from her country, and that African nursemaid was a positive force in her life and may have made her more open to falling in love with Othello when she is a young woman. And this is developed in Toni Morrison's beautiful piece called Desdemona, which is a performance piece that features Desdemona and Amelia and African singers and dancers providing music, kind of retelling the whole story from the point of view of the Amelia Desdemona couple. So that is definitely, it's not explicit in Shakespeare, but it's definitely a resource that we can look at in Shakespeare.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Let me go ahead
and the novel Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell is about Shakespeare's wife, and it's very fictional, very speculative. It's quite a beautiful piece of writing, won a bunch of awards, and in that novel, Maggie O'Farrell imagines the wife, Anne Hathaway, who she refers to as Agnes, which is an alternate spelling of Anne. She imagines Agnes Hathaway as a kind of a wise woman and a healer who understands all the remedies that are in the woods, and becomes really a kind of a doctor, midwife, plague doctor, counselor, a little bit witchy, but not too witchy, in the town of Stratford. And it's not based on any reality in terms of Shakespeare's life, but it's a very interesting depiction of a healer from the period. So it's just a beautiful novel. So I highly recommend it.
Thank you. And Mary Ellen highlighted that in the chat box.
There's
a comment, and then perhaps the final sort of question.
Yes.
Lisa Ashley talks about the multiple ways of knowing that are part of the Canadian Community Health Nursing Standards of Practice. And she mentions that it integrates much of what you've discussed, and it does speak to the transformative power of nursing. As you mentioned, transition. And I am blanking on the nurse theorist, but there is a nurse theorist in the past who says nursing is transitions. That is the focus of nursing, you know, the transitions from illness to health, from here to there.
Well, Patricia Benner does talk about that in the book that you sent me to.
Yeah.
She has a chapter on transitions that I found very helpful. And she's, of course, coming from a kind of Heideggerian phenomenological hermeneutic point of view. So that totally worked for me as a literary person.
Yes, Malaise. Thank you, Jessica. Yes, that is the nursing scholar I was thinking. I'll just end with this last question, and it says, thank you so much for this presentation. It is interesting how historical ways of knowing in nursing are embraced or not in current nursing practice. And I love that, Lisa, and you brought up this historical, the historical ways of knowing, because it's not something that I think we speak a lot of in nursing. We talk about personal knowing. Jess, I know that this is a question close to your heart, but thank you for bringing that up, the historical element of knowing and how important that is. And yes, this is my favorite topic, Jess says. So I don't know if you have any last words to say on that before we have to end this incredibly lovely and generative webinar.
Well, it's just been so wonderful, Miriam, to get to read your stuff and preparing for this, and some other works that I discovered through you and through hunting around and through my wonderful graduate students. And it's very exciting. And I love this kind of cross-disciplinary conversation. I know we have people from the Shakespeare Center community, Kirk Davis and others here as well. So it's not just nurses, we've got people from English and philosophy, and my sister who's a designer. And so I just want to thank everybody for coming and being part. Marianne Guido, hi. It's just a great group here, and it's been really fun to get to share with you and to prepare this and think more deeply about these texts.
And think differently. I mean, thank you for helping us to think differently.
Aww.
Thank you for forcing me to now go read and see Shakespeare. I'm definitely going to do that. As Kirk Davis says, we need similar bridging talks with the schools of computer science and physics, biology. Kurt, reach out. Maybe we can do computer science and nursing. There's a lot there as well. So I want to end this talk by thanking you so much for your efforts and your talk and your presentation and your dialoguing with us here in this space. Incredibly fascinating and generative. I really appreciate you, Julia. Thank you for coming to talk. Just one last thing to all the participants. We have recorded this. The recording will be sent as a URL link to everyone that has registered for the event. So please look forward to that coming into your inbox. And I bid and wish everybody as safe and sane and healthy a rest of the day and week and month as you can possibly have. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you, everyone. It was super fun. I see Sarah Odell and David Mellett says, thank everybody for coming. It's really nice.
All right. Bye.
Bye.